The wind howled across the granite peaks like a wild creature mourning its own loneliness. Somewhere between the clouds and the pines stood a man broad-shouldered, silent, and carved from the same rough stone as the mountain he called home. His name was Calder Ridge, though most folks in the nearest town just called him the Mountain Man. They said he'd been up there too long, that the wilderness had claimed his voice, his heart, and maybe even his sanity. But Calder wasn't mad, he was tired. But then came the doctor's words, quiet, clinical, final. "I'm sorry, Mr. Ridge, you'll never be able to father a child." The world had cracked open that day, and the man who walked out of the clinic wasn't the same man who'd walked in. He sold his ranch, packed his tools, and went up into the mountains alone, where no one would ask him about heirs or legacy ever again. For 6 years, solitude was his companion. He chopped wood, hunted elk, and spoke only to the wind. Then, one winter evening, someone knocked on his cabin door. At first, Calder thought he was imagining it. The wind often played tricks, but then it came again. 3 sharp raps, urgent and trembling. He reached for the old rifle by the door, cracked it open, and peered through the storm. A figure stood there, wrapped in a tattered coat, hair plastered to her cheeks by snow. "Please," she gasped. "I need help." He didn't move for a long moment. Strangers never came this high up the mountain. But something in her voice, raw and frightened, broke through the years of silence. He opened the door wider. She stumbled inside, collapsing by the fire. Her clothes were soaked, her skin ghost pale. Calder dropped his rifle, grabbed a blanket, and wrapped her tight. "You'll freeze if you stay wet," he muttered, his voice rough from disuse. Thank you," she whispered, looking up at him. Her eyes were the color of the storm, gray, fierce, and endless. He poured her a cup of coffee, the only thing hot in the cabin. She drank, hands trembling. "What were you doing up here?" he asked. "I was trying to find my brother," she said. "He was hunting with some friends. Their camp went missing 3 days ago." Calder frowned. He knew these mountains better than anyone. If they're lost, it's a death sentence in weather like this. "I can't leave him," she said, clutching the blanket. "He's all I have." Something in her tone stirred a memory. He'd buried the sound of someone who'd lost everything but hope. "My name's Calder," he said after a pause. "You can stay here tonight. Tomorrow, we'll look." She hesitated. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're already here," he said flatly, then softened. "The storm won't let you leave anyway." Her name, she told him, was Elara Wynn. She was from the valley below, a teacher by trade, strong-willed but gentle in speech. Over the next few days, while the blizzard raged outside, Calder and Elara shared silence, stories, and slow trust. She learned how he lived without electricity, without neighbors, without noise. He learned that she had come from a life full of people, but empty of warmth since her parents died. He didn't tell her about his past, the heartbreak, the child he'd never have, the reason he'd run. But she could see it in his eyes, the grief of a man who'd stopped believing in miracles. When the storm finally cleared, Elara insisted on searching for her brother. Calder went with her, though the trail was cruel, steep, frozen, unkind. They walked for hours until they found what was left of the camp: torn tents, scattered gear, no batas. Calder crouched by the fire pit, examining the ashes. "They were alive 2 nights ago," he said. "Maybe they went south." Elara's voice cracked. "Then we keep going." They did, and as the days turned to a week, Calder found something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. He was no longer just surviving. He was protecting. Each night, when they returned to the cabin, he'd light the fire and watch her sketch maps by lantern glow, her hair catching the light like spun gold. The mountain no longer felt empty. On the 8th day, they found her brother injured but alive in a ravine, half buried under snow. Calder carried him back to the cabin in his arms, steps steady and sure. That night, as Elara sat beside her brother's cot, tears streaming down her cheeks, she looked up at Calder and said softly, "You saved him. You saved me." Calder shook his head. "You'd have done the same." "No," she said, standing and stepping closer. "You've been saving people long before you ever met me. You just stopped believing you could." He didn't know how to answer that. For the first time in years, he couldn't hide behind silence. When Elara and her brother finally left for the valley, Calder stood on the porch, watching them disappear into the snow. He told himself it was better that way, that she belonged where life still moved. But the quiet that returned afterward was different this time. It wasn't peace. It was loss. Weeks passed. The mountain thawed into spring. Calder tried to go back to his old rhythm, chopping wood, fixing traps, ignoring the echo of her laughter in the halls. But every sunrise brought a hollow ache he couldn't explain. Until one morning, a rider came up the path. It was the town's old doctor, carrying a letter. "From a Miss Wynne," he said. "She said you'd want to read it." Calder took it with calloused hands and unfolded it slowly. "Dear Calder, I thought I came to the mountain to find my brother, but I think fate brought me there to find you. There's something you should know, something that might change everything. Please come down to the valley when the snows melt. Elara." Calder read the letter 3 times before lowering it. The wind moved through the trees like a whisper, and for the first time in 6 years, Calder Ridge smiled. He didn't know it yet, but that letter would lead him to the truth he'd buried long ago. The sterile mountain man who thought he'd never have an heir was about to become a father. The spring thaw came slowly that year, like the mountain itself wasn't ready to let go of winter. Calder Ridge watched the ice melt from the eaves of his cabin, each drop landing in the muddy earth below, with a sound that seemed to echo through the quiet valley. The letter from Elara lay folded on the table, edges softened from how many times he'd read it. He told himself he had no reason to go down. He told himself the mountain was his home, his world, his shield. But every morning he woke with her voice in his mind. "Please come down to the valley when the snows melt." By the time the first flowers pushed through the thawing ground, Calder had packed his gear. He saddled his old horse, a stubborn bay named Flint, and started down the narrow trail that wound through pines and mist. It had been years since he'd seen the town, the sound of bells, the smell of baking bread, the sight of people. He felt like a ghost among the living when he reached the valley. The townsfolk watched him with quiet curiosity. The once young rancher had returned, weathered and silent, looking like a man who'd stepped out of legend. Children pointed from porches. Old men nodded in respect. He asked for Elara Wynne, and the blacksmith pointed him toward the small cottage by the river. When Calder reached it, he hesitated. The cottage door was open, and inside he heard laughter, soft, high-pitched, the kind that made the air lighter. He knocked. Elara appeared in the doorway, sunlight spilling around her like a halo. She looked different, softer somehow, but stronger too. And in her arms, she held a child. "Calder," she breathed, eyes wide with surprise and something else he couldn't name. "You came. I got your letter," he said, his voice rough. "You said there was something I should know." She stepped aside, motioning him in. "You'd better sit." Calder entered, every nerve taut. The room smelled of bread and lavender, and beside the cradle near the window lay another baby, fast asleep, cheeks rosy, tiny hands curled into fists. Elara watched him carefully. "Calder, these are my twins, 2 months old." "Congratulations," he managed. "They're beautiful." "They're yours," she said softly. The words hit him like an avalanche. He froze, every muscle locking in disbelief. "That's impossible," he said, shaking his head. "Elara, you don't understand. I can't. But sometimes life doesn't care about what's possible." He stared at her, torn between confusion and awe. How could this be? Elara sat beside the cradle, her eyes never leaving his. "When I came up that mountain, I was broken, lost, desperate. But you gave me strength again. You saved my brother, and you reminded me that hope still lives, even in the coldest places. Something happened that winter, Calder. Something neither of us can explain." He sank into the chair, staring at the babies. One of them began to fuss, a tiny cry filling the air. Without thinking, Calder reached out, and the child's hand wrapped around his finger. So small, so perfect. He felt something deep within him crack open, something he thought had frozen long ago. "I thought I'd made peace with the idea of never having a family," he whispered. "But seeing them, I don't know what to feel." Elara smiled faintly. "Feel whatever you need to. They don't need explanations. They just need you." He looked up, meeting her eyes, those same gray, storm-born eyes that had haunted his solitude. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I wasn't sure how," she admitted. And part of me was afraid you'd vanish back into the mountain, that the world up there meant more to you than anything down here. Calder stood and crossed to the window, staring out at the river glinting in the sun. The mountain gave me peace, he said slowly, but it never gave me life. Maybe I was waiting for someone to show me how to live again. Elara moved closer until her hand rested on his arm. Then stay. Not for me, for them. He turned toward her, the air between them thick with quiet emotion. You really believe they're mine? I don't just believe it, she said. I know it. Look at them, Calder, they have your eyes. The same rare color that mirrored his reflection. In the cabin window all those lonely years. His breath caught. I spent half my life thinking I'd been cursed, he murmured. But maybe it was all leading to this. Elara smiled, tears shimmering in her lashes. Fate doesn't always take the straight path. The next few days blurred into something quiet and new. Calder helped mend the fence by the cottage, fetched wood, held the twins as they slept against his chest. Sometimes at night, when the babies were asleep and the fire was low, he and Elara would sit together in silence. You could stay here, you know. There's room, and the babies need their father. Calder smiled faintly. I don't know how to be a father. You'll learn, she said. The best ones always do. He studied her face, the way the firelight traced her features, and felt something shift deep within him. The mountain man who once hid from the world now had a reason to stay, not because he was healed, but because he was needed. Days turned to weeks. The town began to whisper again, about how the hermit from the mountain had returned, about the woman who'd softened his heart, about the miracle twins who'd defied the odds. Calder didn't care what they said. Each morning, he woke to the sound of laughter instead of wind. Each evening, he held his children and thanked to God he'd stopped believing in for giving him back his life. Then he locked it for the last time and rode down toward the valley, where Elara and the twins waited. As he reached the cottage, the babies giggled from the porch, and Elara lifted her hand in greeting. Calder dismounted and walked toward them, not as the sterile mountain man the world had known, but as a father, a partner, and a man reborn. For years, he'd lived believing life had ended for him. But sometimes, endings are only the quiet beginnings of miracles. He bent down, kissed each of his children's foreheads. But I see now, I was just waiting. Elara smiled. For us, for home, he said. The wind swept through the valley, gentle and warm, carrying away the last of the mountain's silence.